Hey, tourpreneurs, it's Mitch Bach, and just a quick note before we begin today's episode. Tourpreneur is currently sponsored by Google. We're thankful for their support of our community, and we are offering with them a completely free course helping you unlock the power and potential of Google's Things to Do program, which is specifically helping tour operators add their tours to Google in new ways that gives you new exposure and more direct bookings. To learn more, go to tourpreneur.com/Google. And as always, show notes, more resources, links to our newsletter, our business coaching community, and so much more are available on tourpreneur.com. Now to the episode.
So welcome to another edition of the Tourpreneur podcast. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Trish Higgins from Shenmark Capital. Trish has spent the best part of 10 years at Shenmark Capital, and Shenmark Capital is an investment fund that seeks to acquire small to medium-sized businesses and tour operators. They specifically look for tour operators that have the following characteristics: an established track record of consistent profitability. How many of us have that? High levels of recurring revenue. How many of us have that? They look for strong local and regional marketing presence and established cohesive teams of employees committed to the future. Now, Trish is so good at this stuff. This is the second time we've invited her back to the podcast. Way back then, I think it was podcast 159, Shane spoke to Trish on some of this stuff before. But since then, because she's a busy girl, she's been out and acquired another couple of tour operators. I believe you got a tour operator in Maine and one down in Florida. Is that correct, Trish?
Yeah, that's correct. We bought a tour operator that has two boats down in Florida. And then we already had a boat tour business up in Maine, and we bought another one. So we've been busy.
So you've been busy. It sounds like it for sure. I also attended Trish's workshop down in San Diego, the last Arrival event, which I thought was one of the best workshops I've ever attended at an Arrival event. So there's another compliment for you, Trish. It really was excellent content. This is a sector of our industry I'm particularly interested in, just because my own background of acquiring businesses, selling businesses, starting businesses. And as I'm often heard in the tourpreneur community saying, if I had my time again, that's code for being old, I would buy more businesses than I would start. I was found doing startups much more challenging, much harder work than I did from acquiring an operator, then building that operator to be a better operator. But that maybe would be just me. So today we're going to be speaking to Trish about her recent experiences of buying these couple of operators she's had. You don't just go out and buy two operators. To buy two, you have to look at lots. So I'm sure you did look at lots, Trish, and I'm sure you've got quite a few lessons for us.
Absolutely. So Shenmark has it's really a family company. It's run by myself, my husband, and my brother-in-law. And we started back in 2015, not in the tourism space at all. We actually started in landscaping. And we're really just looking to buy businesses that we think we can own for the long term. We now own several businesses in different sort of sectors of the economy. But we sort of stumbled onto the tourism space through a boat tour business that was for sale kind of just right in our backyard that we were introduced to in 2019. And we kind of got to know the owner, got to know the operation, and said, we think people are going to be coming to Maine and going out in the water for the foreseeable future, and that it might be a good fit for the company here. And so we acquired that business about a week before COVID hit, which was not a great time to buy it. But now that that's a little bit in the rearview mirror, the COVID year was a difficult year, but in some ways we learned a lot about the business. And then we've been kind of building on the team since, and our offerings since then. But to buy that business, we look at so many to find, probably 100 or 1,000 to find one that fits for us. You could kind of look at a company in a lot of different ways, which is why that number is kind of a little squishy. But there has to be a perfect match of a business that we find interesting. So there are lots of businesses out there that are great businesses, but just don't really fit with our, framework for the types of businesses we're looking for. So we have to find one that fits. And then we have to find it at the time when an owner is interested in actually selling, because, some people aren't interested in selling. And then assuming that we're both interested in a transaction, then we have to agree to a price and terms, which is also can be very difficult to do. And so a lot of things really have to go right. There's a lot of timing and some luck involved, and just kind of meeting people at the right time. We're working with owners who are looking to retire. And so, I might talk to one person today that says, I have no interest in selling my business. And then, something could happen in their life 2 months from now, and they could say, you know what, now's the time. And so there's a lot of factors that come around. So for us, and our job here is just to make sure people know that we're an option, and kind of know what we're looking for, and then kind of get our name out so that people know that if and when they do want to retire, we might be a good person to talk to.
Sure. When I think back, when I was buying businesses, I had lots of systems, but the very simple system I had, which is not one I'm about to recommend, by the way, is I always looked at 3 types of businesses to buy. There was a great business, and I was never interested in great businesses to buy. 1, they would be very expensive, and 2, the upside would be quite limited because they were such a great business. And then you'd look at business, and I would class it as a good business, but you could see some upside in it, but it was a good, solid business. And if I was advising folks to buy businesses, that's the sort of business I would be advising people to buy. Get a good, solid business with some of the characteristics we mentioned earlier. Still has upside for all the effort and time you're going to put in, plus the capital you're going to get in to get the business moving. And then there was a poor business, businesses that I look at that were more or less broken. And that was my sort of business. I'm an engineer going back for years, so I like fixing broken things. Poor businesses were always attractive to me, but I would not recommend that unless you really know what you're doing, because buying a poor business means you get it cheap, but you have so much work to do to put it back on. In some ways, it's a bit like buying a startup that's so far down the line, but it's still pretty broken. So it's not one I recommend, but it's one that my personal makeup is the place I like to play. Where is it that Shenmark and yourself plays on that ladder?
Yeah, quite a similar sort of framework. It's great if we can find a wonderful business, but as sort of long-term owners, and we're sort of managing our own and employees, our shareholders here. So we sort of have a responsibility not to be paying, sort of really, really high valuations for things, because we need it to kind of work for the long term. We're not looking to buy a business, grow it quickly, and then sell it to somebody else. We're looking to own it for the long term. And so typically speaking, really great businesses are too expensive for us, similar to what your experience. And sort of on the other end of the barbell, we have not in the tourism space, but certainly fallen sort of to the siren song of the cheap business that looks like it has easy things to fix. And I think that there are people who certainly do that and do it really well. It's not really how we're oriented, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and you really need to go in with a plan and the right team to help you do it. And it's just, we found it to be more of a distraction and a headache than something that really is exciting for us. And so we end up sort of staying away from the really cheap sort of distressed companies. I think that earlier on when we started, those were more interesting than they are now to us. And so we really stay in the middle. Companies that are good, solid businesses, because we're working with people who are retiring owners, they have typically been in the business for some 20, 30 years. And there's often things that can be done in the business to make it better, but the owners are tired, or they know that those things could happen, but they're like, I don't want to spend the time doing that, or it's working just fine right now, let's not sort of upset things, and or sort of, I have other stuff going on in my life, I kind of have one foot out the door, or I'm just kind of keeping it run right. And so those are the businesses that are most interesting to us, because we can kind of bring new energy into the business. And sometimes that involves sort of, this system really worked great 20 years ago when you put it in place, and you did all that work to put it to sort of get it to be part of the business. But things have changed since then, and there are other systems that might, be better. So an example would be, I see a lot of businesses that do payroll by hand and have sort of manual time clock, sort of, punch in, punch out type things. And honestly, those do work. But you can save yourself a lot of time from a sort of employee management system if you have an electronic clock in and clock out that syncs automatically to your payroll. That can save hours of work a week of often sort of tedious, annoying work. So those are the sorts of things that we look for in a business. Say, we could kind of come in and not change sort of the core of the business, but sometimes, some things like how you're tracking employee, time tracking, or how are you keeping your books, are you really using sort of all the technology that's out there? Are you using, credit card readers? Are you using tablets for food and beverage on wherever your, point of sale is? Those sorts of things that some businesses just haven't really updated in the past 10 or 20 years, and can really add, some efficiency to the company. So those are the sorts of things that we find interesting, which I'd say is that in that solid middle, good business. And I think the main thing, last thing, is that we think about it is, you just want to make sure that you're not paying an A+ price for a B business.
Yeah.
And so, for a B business, you pay a B price. And the hard part, kind of going back to getting a deal across the finish line, is most business owners think their business is A+ kind of regardless.
Yeah.
And so that's where you need to do a little work to say, this is what I think your business is worth. It might not be worth as much as you think it is. That's typically the conversation that we're having.
So one of the questions, it's the first question I ask operators, and I've been asking them in the Twopreneur group when they've posted questions about selling their business. The first question I asked is, have you prepared your business for sale? So of all the businesses you've looked at, I'm not going to say how many I found prepared for sale. Of all the businesses you looked at, how many had actually did the legwork to prepare the business for sale?
I'd say less than 10%, probably. Yeah.
I found this amazing. Good for buyer, bad for seller. A business is not prepared for sale. It makes the duration of the transaction or the deal stretch out much longer, and the whip hand is automatically given to the buyer because the owner hasn't put the hours in to prepare the business to sell. And it is, as I'm sure you're going to highlight, having sold my own businesses, preparing a business for sale is not a quick thing. It's quite an in-depth, protracted thing that should probably be started years ahead of the actual sale point. So you're building up all the documentation, and as you go, and it becomes a system. So the fact that we're on the same page there, that most owners haven't prepared the business for sale, what would be your advice to entrepreneurs listening in here, even if they're not thinking of selling their business at this moment, but some of them may have been going 10 years, some of them may have been going 15 years. The time will come when they all have to get out of the business.
Sure. So if I'm being sort of tough, I'd say that if you're running your business well today, it's ready to, you're ready to sell it. So a lot of the things that you do to sort of get a business ready to sell means having information that is available and understandable and accurate. And so, an example is, I looked at a business and, their book, I couldn't really get any reliable information from their financial statements. And I would argue that, whether you're selling your business or not, you should want to have, accurate financial statements, but, everyone's business, they can do whatever they want with their own business. But when you're looking to sell, me or somebody like me is going to ask you for probably historical financial statements, a list of your capital expenditures, which is not a huge ask, but for some people they can say, oh, well, I'll get back to you in like 2 or 3 months once I've got that already. And to me, that says, you know what, like you're really not sort of running the business as well as you probably should be if it takes you that long to kind of pull all that information together. And I get it. I mean, if you've been running your business for 20 years, the financial, like you feel in your gut how the business is doing. The financial statements you're probably not really looking at. But for somebody coming in from the outside, that's like the number one thing they're going to be looking at. And so you need to have those sort of ready to go. So that's the big thing. And then another really big thing that really hangs us up is people running personal expenses through the business, which pretty much every small business owner does in some capacity, but not having documentation or sort of justification available for those things. So if you are going to do that, saying, okay, well, I'll just make up numbers. My business has $500,000 of earnings, but if you look at the financial statements, it looks like we have none because I actually run my personal boat through the business and my daughter's on salary, but she doesn't work here. And we took a trip to Disneyland and blah, 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 blah. And so for a person coming in from the outside, it can be really hard to sort of separate personal from business. And so you really get the true understanding of, what an accurate, reflection of the financials are. So I think people need to realize that, one, it takes time to sell your business. And two, if you don't have your financials sort of in order, it's going to take, I would say, probably a year longer than it should to sell. And you're also probably not going to get the highest valuation for your business because you're going to, the buyer's going to have lots of questions. It's going to reflect poorly on your business. So those are big things. Get your books in order and realize it's going to take a while.
And I do have some issues with entrepreneurs on this because in reality, it doesn't matter how long you've been going. The technology's there, the software's there now, the skill base is there, and bookkeepers and accountants if you need there. I mean, if you're running a business and it's serious, you should really be getting a set of monthly accounts every month, and then certainly a quarterly set of accounts, and then yearly you have to have a set of accounts because you have to submit them. So it is, you're never going to maximize the profitability of your business if you're not addressing the numbers on a regular basis. And I know we all get to the stage where we understand the numbers just because of experience and time. But just by knowing it in your head and feeling you're doing okay, you're going to miss so many opportunities to increase your profitability. And the other thing from experience, if you don't stay on top of it, your costs start to run away with themselves. The costs just creep up, and you haven't really factored in that capital cost that you're going to buy that other boat or or their boss, you haven't really factored in the real cost of these other two employees, not the amount you're paying them, but the real cost, because there's lots of costs on top of the employees that you pay, because you haven't really studied the numbers on a monthly and quarterly and yearly basis. So that would be my kind of first comment on the financial side. And I've certainly found from buying and selling, yes, it's the numbers first. Everybody wants to see the numbers, which I totally get, because you're not going to dig any deeper if they don't stack up. And I'm sure we'll come back to numbers later on this. The other thing I think operators need to be aware is a lot of the potential buyers are not in this industry. Right? There's people who have come to a certain point in their life from different sectors, different industries, maybe been made redundant or got a payout or made some money in another sector, or have been in big corporate paying jobs and they just want to get out because they're burnt out and they want to do something different in lifestyle. So they have a bunch of cash and they want to get into this industry, but they know nothing about it. So they're probably capable of reading the numbers, but they're not capable of coming in and running your business. So there needs to be an operation manual built up over, certainly not when you decide to run the business, but years before, actually documenting what it is your business does. And you have to treat it in a way that this is to be given to someone who understands nothing about your food tour business or your boat business or your adventure business or your ski business. It has to be a step-by-step guide for someone to actually run the business. And I've yet to find operators who actually do that.
I mean, this would kind of go back to you're running your business. You think, I'm not going to retire for 10 years, or maybe I'm never going to retire. But if 90% of the information about how to run your business is in your head, then you really don't have a business. You have just sort of a guy with a job. And that's a big thing that we try to distinguish about is this an actual business, or is this just one person who knows everything? And if that person goes away, there really isn't a business. And so if you're trying to sell your business, what you're selling is something that exists without you there. And even if you're staying on to help in a transition or all those sorts of things, a buyer is going to want to know, can this business survive without the owner? And I think that even if you're a small business owner who has no intention of selling, putting together, sort of basic manuals for all the processes is a good thing, because what happens if you're in a car accident, right? Like, what happens if you get sick? Something happens, one of your family members might need to step in. There might need to be, somebody come in to help run the business. And if you have been storing all the information about how everything works in your head and been doing it all yourself, then you have a problem. And so that's not just something that you take, an hour and write all down. It's something that takes time to sort of develop those sorts of things. And ideally, you're also training other people in the business how to how a lot of other things run. You're not just doing everything yourself. So an example is the first business we brought up in Maine. The owner was very involved on the business side, but he had sort of a second in command who he had been training basically like every day for the past 15, 20 years. And that individual was staying on, and that person knew a lot of stuff to do with the business that if the owner left, a new person could come in and learn from that other individual. So it's both having the manuals, but then also trying to train some of your people on how some of these things work, so that if you're not there, the business can still continue to operate.
Yeah. Going back to some of the financials, and again, from businesses that I've run the rule over myself, and it isn't the majority, I'm not going to say a percentage, but the majority of business I looked at, they would come up with, like, we're doing X revenue, X 100,000, a million, and then there's another 100,000 or 200,000 in cash.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, well, that's interesting, but I'm not paying for cash because there is no evidence of cash. And
Right.
if you have had cash, well, you've had the value of cash. Therefore, as a buyer, you don't buy cash.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
absolutely. I mean, this is especially in the tour industry, because you are handling cash a lot, people paying for things or whatever. You come up with this issue a lot because I looked at one boat tour business where I would say he was probably keeping, if I had to estimate, 60 to 70% of the revenue was being paid in cash, because it was a lot of walk-ups, a lot of, he only had a cash bar. He sort of pushed the business towards cash, and he was getting a huge amount of value in cash. But if you looked at his, and I would estimate he was probably making $500,000 a year total in revenue, keeping most of it in cash. And then when you look at his financials, it looks like he makes, 80 or, 90,000 in revenue and however many thousands in profit. And so his business looks dramatically smaller than I think it actually was. As a buyer, it would be very hard for me to get comfortable with figuring out a value for that, because even though he might say, yeah, all this cash is here, I'm like, can you prove it? I don't know. I both don't know what revenue was paid for in cash, but I also don't know what expenses were paid for in cash. So, could there be expenses that maybe there were just some employees that you paid cash under the table? There's no documentation or record of that. So it's very hard to buy a business where there's a lot of the value is in these cash transaction, and they could exist and they could be great, but they could not. And that just represents a lot of risk for me as the buyer. And honestly, at this point, it's just something that we're going to walk away from, because it's such a hassle to figure out. And the difference in value for the business, because the owner knows they're getting all that money. And so they're like, well, hey, no, my business has whatever, $500,000 of revenue. And I'm like, well, no, your business actually has $100,000 of revenue. And so to figure out a price point that makes sense is I think basically almost impossible and not worth the effort. And so I think if somebody's serious about selling their business, you kind of have to make a decision. You're clearly doing the tax things the cash thing to avoid paying taxes. So you can't maximize your personal income through not reporting cash sales, and also maximize the value of your business in a transaction. You kind of don't get it both ways. And so I would argue that if you're actually reporting things properly, you're going to make up for it when you sell your business and you get the full value that you want. But that is more of a long-term perspective. And unfortunately, many small business owners tend to be more focused on kind of the short-term cash in my pocket. So that can create a real problem. And there are some businesses out there, honestly, I just don't know how they're ever going to sell themselves because it's such a problem.
Yeah, I'm actually seeing it getting less than it was, but that's maybe just because of society moving more and more to electronic payment rather than cash payment. But I agree, in this sector particularly, it is still a lot of cash getting with walk-ins, a lot of cash flying about, which you can't pay for it twice. And it does make a lot of deals collapse because the buyer won't pay for the cash and the seller values the cash as part of the business. Talking about the value business, and this is a question that comes up every week in the Tourpreneur group, how do I value my business? Now, for people who have never sold a business before and they see all these things on the news from different industries and different sectors and software that have annual recurring revenues that get multiples of 8, 10 on the revenue, not the profit. And a year ago, some software were getting multiples of 20 on the revenue. I don't think that would happen today, but again, not the profit. Whereas we're in a business, tourism, just discussed a bit about cash. We're really selling businesses on a multiple of profit, not multiple as much as I'd have loved to be selling on a multiple of revenue. We're really in the game of selling on a multiple of profit. So could you just talk a little bit, Trish, on how you go about value in a business?
Sure. So, we are certainly looking at a multiple of profits, which is sometimes more complicated because, as sort of people are doing these sort of things with their financials, especially the pushing personal expenses through, their expenses or their earnings look lower. And so that's where we have to kind of go through the dance of figuring out what actually run rate earnings are. And so we look at things as a multiple of earnings. Typically, our rule of thumb is 3 to 5 times earnings, depending on the value of the business. The hard part that we have found for asset-heavy tour businesses, so boat tours would be an example, maybe like bus tours, things like that, is that a lot of, or not a lot, some business owners don't necessarily think about the return they're getting on their assets.
Yeah.
And so we've had situations where, let's say I've looked at a business where there's, again, let's say 500, $500,000 of earnings, which is a great business. That's awesome, right? That person's doing an awesome job. So $500,000 of earnings, let's say I'm going to put 3 times on it. I'm going to say this business is worth $1.5 million. That's just baseline example. But they have a boat that's worth $2.5 million. So they bought this boat and they have been doing, whatever to the boat. And in a lot of cases, the boat can be worth more than the business, which is a tricky spot to get yourself into. Because in that situation, you may be better off financially to just see if you can sell the boat outright and shut down the business, which is sad because, I always am a fan of businesses staying, around. But that is something that I see a lot in boat tours. I would say probably 70% of the boat tour operations I look at, from my perspective, the value of the assets, specifically the boats, is higher than the value of the cash being generated from those boats, from my perspective. So that can be a really tricky thing. So you kind of, when you're coming into to sell, you need to think about where are my earnings and be aware of, okay, someone's going to look at my earnings and the multiple of my earnings, but then also what's the value of my assets? And, are the assets worth more than the business is worth? And some people like to say you should pay a multiple of the earnings and you should buy my boat separately. So they say like, oh, well, you should pay $1.5 million for the earnings of the business. And then you should also pay $2.5 million for my boat. And I would say that if you're using the boat to generate the earnings, the boat is the business. That would be my perspective on that. It could be a little different if there's, I'm trying to think, if there are some assets in your business that you think are worth a lot, but you're not actually using them to generate the cash flows in your business, then often the way we bridge that gap is to say, okay, well, we're just buying this one boat and the name brand and all that sort of stuff, but you've got this other stuff that isn't really used in the business. You think it's worth a lot. You should just go sell that to other people. So those are sort of the, like an example would be, I've looked at a boat tour operator that has way too many boats for what they actually do. So let's say they have 6 boats. If you look at their business, they really only need 3 to operate. They just have these extra ones because maybe they do a couple of like additional harbor tours or something that don't really generate a lot. And they like to have a backup boat and all this stuff. In that situation, I would say, listen, we're just going to buy the name brand, everything associated with the business, and these 3 boats. These other ones that you think are worth a lot, you should try to sell them in an area, like try to sell them down in wherever, another area that's not competitive with ours, and get the full value for them there. So that's sometimes how you can kind of bridge a gap with that. But that's the big thing that I'm always looking at when I'm looking at specifically boat tour businesses is what's the value of the boats? What's the value of the business? Do those things kind of come together?
Coming out of COVID, a lot of asset-based businesses may have went into COVID with next to no debt or little debt, but they're coming out of COVID with significant debt. Sometimes they have to refinance the assets, like the actual boats or the buildings or whatever it was, their assets that were helping them to generate the revenue. I certainly have seen globally a lot of refinancing of assets. So the businesses are now in recovery stage. They've now got finance, some of them significant finance on their assets. How do you deal with that when you're looking at purchasing?
Yeah, so that's also a tricky thing, because sometimes, we have looked at a lot of businesses, not tourism, as well as pretty much everywhere, where you realize that people have taken out so much debt on their assets because it's available and it's cheap.
Yep.
That once you factor in the value of the business, and let's use the business I think is worth $1.5 million, and they have a $2 million boat. I pay them $1.5 million in cash, but they might have $1 million of debt left on the boat. And so when you think about the cash someone's going to walk away at the end of the day, sometimes it can be almost zero if they have a lot of debt on the business, because we're not taking over the debt. They have to pay it off. And so that can be a very difficult thing, particularly when people are approaching retirement age, because they're saying, for my retirement plan, I need whatever to sell my business for $1 million to have my retirement funds, as an example. And so they say that, and so they're looking for that amount in their business. But then if they also have $1 million of debt they need to pay off, then all of a sudden they need to sell their business for $2+ million, so that they can kind of get to the net amount of their retirement nut, which sometimes that corresponds with a value that we have in mind, and sometimes it does not. And so that's always a tricky thing. And honestly, it's something for people, again, going back to planning, thinking ahead. Even if you're running a boat tour business or a whatever business, zip line business, a food tour, whatever it is, and you're 30 years old, at some point you're going to want a nest egg, and you should be thinking about, how much, if I'm taking out debt, is that to help grow my business? Which, fine, maybe it is, but you're going to need to pay it back at some time, and how is this going to translate into the value I get at the end of the day? I think it's something to just be aware of, kind of at all times, because sort of you need to be thinking about the net after you pay back everything you owe as what you're going to do.
One of the things I speak to operators about, and I get it, they're so passionate about their business and they go all in, particularly if they get past the 5-year point, the 10-year point, and then it's all in. We're going for the 20, 25 years, maybe 30 years. So they're all in. Everything the business generates gets reinvested back into the business. They take some money out in wages and all the things you were talking about earlier. They may take some dividends out if it's having good years and profit. But on the whole, it's reinvest in the business, build the business to it's bigger and better. And they're all in on this final value, where someone like yourself comes along, and if you can get an agreement, all is great. But you and I both know the amount of businesses that do not sell is a significant number. It's the bigger majority of businesses don't sell, rather than certainly in the UK, where I'm a buyer, it's less than 10% sell within 2 years of going on the market. That's across all businesses. So it's a high stakes game to go all in, to plan in 20 years' time, I'm going to sell my business and reinvest in it. So I consistently say to operators, and it's a personal choice to everybody, if your business is doing well and you're making significant profits, maybe the strategy for you is to take the money out the business on a consistent periods of time over X number of years, and reinvest in other sectors, reinvest in other investments more, because travel and tourism is a volatile business. And if you're consistently making good money, sometimes the strategy is to take out, reinvest in real estate, reinvest in the market, reinvest in whatever, but something that is a bit more secure and stable. And then once you get to that 25-year point, you've still got a business to sell, but you're not that hung up on it, as your point, as they need to get the $1 million for the retirement fund. It becomes a bit easier because you have another retirement fund that's been built up by the business over a significant number of years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, listen, at Chenmark, we're investing most of the profits back into the business to grow the business. So I can't say that, we're taking huge amounts out to diversify away. That's certainly not our overall corporate strategy. That said, we're still making sure that we're saving for retirement. And, it's not as if any business, no matter what, could go to zero, like any business.
Yeah.
And so you need to always be thinking, okay, well, if my business went to zero, what do I have? Do I have, a little bit of a nest egg that I've been able to save up? Do I have, money in retirement accounts that's sort of building and working in the background and I'll touch in 30 years and all of those things? I think you need to balance it. And I also think if you're balancing it, you're more likely to make smarter decisions in your business because you're not feeling like the stress of, oh, well, I need to take this risk to do this extra, maybe new risky purchase or new market or new offering to get it to where I want it to go. You might be able to be a little bit more patient and kind of in building up your business if you're making sure that you're sort of being taken care of sort of outside of the business, a little diversified outside the business. You can feel a little more patient, not like you have to take big risks and stuff like that. So I would say for what we do, it is, certainly a huge portion of our, net worth is still tied to our business, but we're still making sure on the side that if something were to happen there, we can, we'd be okay. And so I think that that's especially important for these business owners. And I think most of the ones that we have actually transacted with, we've actually gotten a deal done, they've been business owners who have had good businesses, but they've taken money out over time. They've bought real estate. They've invested in other things. They still have a number, but it's not, I have worked with people where that number is, you can feel the stress and anxiety around having to get a certain number. Otherwise, sort of all of your retirement plans fall apart. And when you're transacting with someone, that can be very stressful for that person. And that stress bleeds into the transaction, which sometimes means it doesn't go the way you want it to go. And I kind of think of selling your business. It's a little bit, I'd say, like dating. Like the less interested you are, the more interested the buyer is. Yep. As a general dating rule, I'd say. And so if you're sort of feeling desperate, like you need to sell your business for a certain amount, the buyer is going to pick that up from a mile away. And they're either going to say, no, thank you, I'm not interested, or they're just going to go real hard at you. And it's probably not going to work out well. So yeah, running your business, to your point, where you have your financials in order, you've trained some other people in the business to do things you can't do, to make sure you're paying yourself along the way, so you still have a little diversification and nest egg. Those are all the things you should be doing now, so that in however, tomorrow, 1 year or 20 years from now, you sort of set up your business and your personal finances in a place so that you can come to the table from a position of strength.
Leading on from that is expectations. And I see this quite a lot. And again, I totally understand why most people selling the business haven't sold a business. Therefore, I get this. But whatever value they've got in their head, $1 million, 500,000, 1.5 million, there's a naivety around that they're going to get all that money in one go up front.
Right.
Whereas we know, I've certainly not bought a business where I've paid the full amount up front in one go. It's been financed in certain ways, often by the seller financer. And businesses have sold, it's been the opposite deal. I'm still getting paid out on businesses I've sold recently. So it's this. Could you just talk about the actual? A deal's been done, everybody's agreed, but when does the payments happen?
Right. And this is, I think, an interesting mechanism because, I mean, when I started, it's like, oh, someone's going to pay, $1 million. You just, $1 million goes into your bank account. But as it happens, we like to see seller financing in all of our deals, where the seller is providing financing for the transaction of some portion. And for us, that one, it helps the deal happen. And two, it also allows us, it provides the buyer with a little bit of confidence. The seller is selling something they're standing behind. They're not selling you a lemon. They're selling you something that says, yeah, I believe everything I've told you is true. And I believe that we can kind of continue to pay, the business will continue to be able to perform and support this financing. So that is something that we like to see. One thing that a lot of deals also have is something called escrow, which is when, when you agree to a price, you look at all these legal documents that take forever to sort through. And in the legal documents, you basically certify that, all the information you provided was true and there's no outstanding legal action and all these things. And then a lot of deals will have something called escrow or a holdback where they pick a number, 10% of the deal price, and they put it into an account held by a lawyer's office or something for a certain period of time, 6 months to 2 years, depending on the situation. And it basically says, assuming that everything that we agreed to kind of pans out, then after that period of time, you get the rest of the money. What we do is we don't have that escrow. We just have seller financing instead of that. So people would get a certain cash payment and then they'll get seller financing paid out over a certain period of time. I think one thing that some business owners have zero interest in seller financing, just hard no. I would say that seller financing can be a very useful tool to bridge a valuation gap. Because if somebody is going to come and say, you know what, you think my business is worth $1 million. I think it's worth $1.5 million, but I'm willing to give that difference to you in the form of a seller note with favorable sort of debt terms. You can pay it all off at the end of, 5 years or something like that. Then that can be a very creative way to bridge a divide in the total valuation if a person is willing to be paid out over time, because it makes things easier from our perspective because we don't have to provide as much cash up front. And we can get more comfortable with a slightly higher valuation if people are willing to provide seller financing. So it kind of works both ways, but I would say most transactions, not just with us, all transactions with us, most transactions, broadly speaking, you don't just get all your money on after you sign the documents. There is a delayed portion of it, and that can be surprising for people, and they have to kind of get their heads around that.
Yeah, I haven't seen it happen. I haven't seen one example of it happen. I'd like to, certainly if it was my own, but I've never seen it happen.
Yeah.
So Trish, I'd like to thank you yet again for coming on to the Tourpreneur podcast. Excellent value for our listeners. I'm sure I will be promoting this around the group and in other places. I do think it's something that our operators tend just to park in the back of their head until the time comes. But we are certainly going to be encouraging them to pay attention to this part of the business much, much more. Because I know if they start preparing 3, 4, 5 years in advance, I know they're going to get bigger value when they actually come to sell the business. So it is certainly something that needs to be done in advance if they're going to release the value of the business. So once again, Trish, thank you very much for your time and all your knowledge.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. If anybody has questions, we talk to a lot of people that are not the right fit for us, but just people say, this is my situation. Do you have any advice? That sort of thing. So people can reach me at Trish at Chenmark, CHENMARK.com. Always happy to chat. Okay,
I'll stick your details on the bottom of the video because this will go as videos as well as podcasts.
Great.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thanks very much, Trish.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.